November 1887 settled over the Bitterroot Valley with a silence that felt wrong. There was no storm to announce it, no violent blizzard to signal danger. The cold simply arrived and stayed. Each morning dawned colder than the last. Breath froze midair. Water stiffened into ice inside buckets left near hearths. In the surrounding forests, trees cracked open as sap froze inside living wood. The valley had endured hard winters before, but this one carried a weight that experienced frontiersmen recognized immediately. This was not a test of comfort. It was a test of survival. Across the valley, families relied on log cabins built according to every accepted rule of frontier construction. Thick timber walls, stone fireplaces, chinked seams, and steep roofs were supposed to protect against winter. Instead, they betrayed their occupants. Heat escaped almost as fast as it was produced. Fires demanded constant feeding, day and night. When flames died down, temperatures inside cabins collapsed within hours. By morning, frost formed on interior walls, and water froze just feet from the firebox. Parents kept children wrapped in wool even indoors, listening for coughs that might not fade. Isaac Breener lived in one of those cabins. He was a carpenter from Pennsylvania, 34 years old, quiet and methodical, with a wife named Catherine and 2 young daughters. His first winter in Montana nearly broke him. He burned through 6 cords of firewood just to keep his family barely warm. That meant months of labor spent cutting, hauling, and burning fuel instead of building a future. Worse, his oldest daughter developed a deep, wet cough that lingered through the coldest nights. Isaac realized something had to change, because the math was simple and unforgiving. The way everyone built homes out here did not work. During those long nights tending the fire, Isaac noticed something others overlooked. Long after the flames died, the stone fireplace continued to radiate warmth. The room grew cold, but the stone stayed warm to the touch. Heat lingered inside it, stored and released slowly. Isaac did not know the term thermal mass, but he understood the principle. Stone remembered heat. And if stone could hold warmth, then so could the earth itself. By summer of 1887, Isaac made a decision that would quietly set him apart from the rest of the valley. Instead of rebuilding another cabin, he chose to build into the land. He selected a south-facing hillside with good drainage and stable soil and began digging. 12 feet into the slope, he carved a space 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep. 3 walls were raw earth. Only the front wall faced the weather, built of stone and timber, with a small window to capture winter sun. The roof was layered carefully with wood, tarred canvas, and a thick blanket of packed sod, heavy enough to insulate against both cold and wind. Inside, Isaac lowered the floor and laid stone beneath their feet. He built a smaller firebox than standard, designed not to blast heat into the air but to charge the surrounding stone. Ventilation channels were cut high into the earth walls to prevent dampness and allow smoke to escape. Every detail served a purpose. The goal was not to fight winter with brute force, but to reduce heat loss so thoroughly that winter had nothing left to steal. The neighbors noticed and laughed. They called it a hole, a cave, a burrow fit for animals rather than families. At the trading post, conversations quieted when Isaac entered. Men shook their heads and offered polite warnings. They were certain his wife would hate it, his children would get sick, and the structure would fail within a year. Isaac listened and kept working. He was not trying to convince anyone. He only needed it to work. The family moved into the dugout before the first snow. Catherine did not complain. The girls treated it like an adventure, running their hands along the cool earth walls and laughing. On October 18, Isaac lit the first fire in the stone hearth. Less than a month later, winter arrived in full force. By mid-November, temperatures plunged below zero and did not recover. Wind stripped heat from exposed cabins faster than fires could replace it. Chimneys cracked. Smoke backed into rooms. Families burned through their wood piles at a terrifying pace. Some abandoned their homesteads entirely, retreating to town buildings with larger stoves. For 32 consecutive days, temperatures never rose above -18 degrees Fahrenheit. It became the longest sustained freeze the valley had ever recorded, and then someone noticed smoke rising from the hillside. It was thin, steady, and calm. Not the frantic smoke of desperation, but the quiet signal of a fire doing exactly what it was meant to do. When a neighbor finally rode up to investigate, he felt the warmth before he reached the doorway. Inside, the temperature hovered above 60 degrees. The fire had been out for hours. Stone and earth held the heat, releasing it slowly and evenly. The children played barefoot on the stone floor. Catherine worked without gloves. Isaac burned a fraction of the wood everyone else consumed. Word spread quickly after that. Visitors arrived, silent and stunned, pressing their palms against the earth walls, feeling a warmth that should not have existed in such cold. Pride gave way to understanding. By spring, men were discussing slopes, soil, stone, and depth. By fall, others began digging into hillsides of their own. Isaac Breener did not invent earth-sheltered construction. Indigenous peoples had used it for centuries. Settlers had relied on sod houses when timber was scarce. But he rediscovered something the frontier had dismissed in its rush toward what looked like progress. The earth is not an enemy. It is insulation, stability, and stored warmth. When the cold wouldn't end, one man trusted the ground instead of fire, and the ground did not fail him. What followed that winter was not immediate celebration or praise, but reflection. When the snow finally loosened its grip and the valley began to breathe again, people did not rush to talk about survival. They talked about loss. About how much wood had vanished into the air. About how many nights were spent awake feeding fires. About how close some families came to abandoning everything they had built. The cold had exposed a weakness no one wanted to admit out loud. Their homes had not protected them. They had barely endured. Isaac Breener's shelter became a quiet point of comparison. Not a spectacle, not a landmark, but a reference. Men would pause near the hillside longer than necessary. They would look at the slope, the softened outline of the sod roof, the way grass already blended it back into the land. It did not look like progress. That was the unsettling part. It looked like something old, something forgotten, something that should not have worked as well as it did. When people finally began asking questions, they were careful with their words. How did it stay dry? Did the walls sweat? Was there mold? Did the roof sag under snow? Isaac answered plainly. Drainage mattered. Airflow mattered. Depth mattered. Nothing about the shelter was accidental. It worked because it was deliberate, not because it was clever. The earth was doing most of the work. He had simply arranged things so it could. Those who stepped inside for the first time noticed how different the space felt from a cabin. The temperature did not cling to the fire or fall away from it. It existed everywhere evenly. The air did not rush or whistle through gaps. It rested. Sound behaved differently too, softer, muted by soil and stone. Even movement slowed. People spoke more quietly without realizing why. The idea that heat could be held instead of constantly produced unsettled many. Frontier life had conditioned people to equate survival with effort. If something worked without constant labor, it felt suspicious. Fire required feeding. Wood required cutting. Warmth required struggle. Isaac's shelter disrupted that belief. It suggested that survival might come not from working harder, but from losing less. By late winter, Samuel Hodges returned more than once. He stood longer each visit, measuring with his eyes, pacing distances, watching how sunlight entered through the small southern window. He asked fewer questions and listened more. When he finally decided to build his own earth-sheltered home, he did not announce it. He simply began digging. Others watched carefully. This time, there was no laughter. The memory of frozen nights was still too close. Samuel's build was not identical to Isaac's, but it followed the same principles. Depth for stability. Earth for insulation. Stone for storage. When his family moved in the following season, the result confirmed what many already suspected. The ground could be trusted. Vernon Cale approached the problem differently. He was not ready to abandon his cabin, but he could not ignore what he had seen. Instead of starting over, he expanded backward into the hillside, connecting an earth-sheltered room to his existing structure. The cabin blocked wind. The earth blocked cold. Together, they performed better than either could alone. It was a compromise, but an effective one. Slowly, the valley's understanding of shelter shifted. Homes were no longer judged solely by how they looked above ground, but by how they behaved in winter. South-facing slopes gained value. Hillsides once ignored became desirable. People began thinking in layers instead of walls, in mass instead of space. The land itself became part of the structure, not something to clear away. Isaac never positioned himself as a teacher. He shared what he knew when asked and returned to his work. That restraint mattered. It allowed others to arrive at the conclusion themselves. No one felt corrected. They felt informed. Knowledge spread not because it was preached, but because it worked. The dugout remained unchanged through the following winters. Fires stayed small. Woodpiles stayed full. The shelter did not care whether the season was mild or brutal. It responded slowly, predictably, indifferent to extremes. In a landscape defined by volatility, that steadiness became its greatest strength. What the winter of 1887 left behind was not just a new way to build, but a new way to think. The frontier had been obsessed with conquering the environment, cutting it down, pushing it back, forcing it into submission. Isaac's shelter suggested another path. Cooperation instead of conquest. Observation instead of assumption, and that idea lingered, long after the snow melted, long after the dugout itself faded back into the hillside. The ground had done what it always does. It held steady. The people were the ones who changed. What most people did not realize at the time was that the real transformation was not architectural. It was mental. The dugouts changed how people understood heat itself. For years, warmth had been treated like something fragile, something that had to be constantly produced, guarded, and defended. Fire was the hero of every frontier home. Without it, a house became uninhabitable within hours. Isaac's shelter revealed a different truth. Heat did not need to be chased. It could be stored, slowed, and stabilized. Men who visited the earth shelters noticed how different the air felt. It was not damp as they had feared. It was dry, calm, unmoving. In log cabins, air constantly leaked through seams, cracks, and warped timber, pulling heat with it. In the dugouts, air stayed put. Movement was controlled, intentional. Ventilation channels allowed moisture to escape without inviting cold drafts inside. The shelter breathed slowly, not violently, and that made all the difference. People began to understand that the most dangerous enemy of warmth was not low temperature, but rapid heat loss. Cabins lost heat through every exposed surface. Roofs radiated it into the night sky. Walls surrendered it to wind. Floors leaked it into frozen ground. Isaac's design reversed that equation. Instead of being surrounded by hostile air, the shelter was wrapped in soil that resisted change. The earth did not care how cold the night became. It stayed steady, acting as a buffer between human life and the extremes above. As more families experimented with earth-sheltered designs, mistakes were made, and lessons followed. Some dug too shallow and suffered water seepage during spring thaw. Others ignored drainage and paid the price when snowmelt pooled against walls. A few underestimated roof weight and had to reinforce after settling occurred. But even those imperfect shelters performed better than cabins ever had. Failure did not mean freezing. It meant adjustment. The most successful builders paid close attention to slope and sunlight. South-facing entrances captured low winter sun, adding passive warmth during daylight hours. Stone placed where sunlight reached it became an additional heat reservoir, slowly releasing energy after sunset. Even small design choices compounded into measurable comfort. The shelters did not rely on a single clever trick. They worked because every element served the same goal, slowing change. By the early 1890s, the valley no longer talked about dugouts as shelters of last resort. They were discussed as practical solutions, especially for families with limited access to timber or labor. Wood saved in winter could be used for barns, fences, and tools instead of disappearing into chimneys. Time once spent feeding fires could be spent tending livestock or preparing land. Warmth was no longer something that demanded constant attention. It became background stability. Isaac Breener remained unchanged by the quiet recognition that followed. He continued his work as a carpenter, helped neighbors when asked, and lived without ceremony. He never wrote plans, never lectured, never claimed authority. His contribution was not instruction, but example. He demonstrated that observation mattered more than tradition, and results mattered more than reputation. Years later, when new settlers arrived, some built cabins first out of habit, only to modify them later. Others started directly with earth-sheltered designs, having heard stories of the winter that tested the valley. The knowledge passed without books or diagrams. It moved through conversation, experience, and memory. It endured because it had proven itself under pressure. What made Isaac's decision powerful was not that it was radical, but that it was restrained. He did not reject fire. He reduced its importance. Fire became a tool rather than a dependency. In a world where fuel meant survival, that shift changed everything. The shelter did not make fire obsolete. It made it efficient. Long after Isaac's dugout disappeared back into the hillside, the principle remained intact. Modern builders would rediscover it during energy shortages, fuel crises, and environmental reevaluations. Engineers would assign formulas and terminology to what Isaac had simply noticed. Thermal lag, heat capacity, insulative mass. But the math only confirmed what the winter of 1887 had already proven. When the cold would not end, brute force failed. Bigger fires failed. More wood failed. What succeeded was patience, restraint, and an understanding of how nature already worked. The ground did not generate heat. It preserved it. It slowed loss. It provided stability in a world defined by extremes, and that, more than any structure or technique, was the lesson the valley carried forward. Survival did not belong to those who burned the most fuel or built the biggest walls. It belonged to those who listened closely, adapted quietly, and trusted solutions that did not need to announce themselves to work. The changes that followed were not dramatic, but they were permanent. Once a family experienced a winter without panic, without constant vigilance over a dying fire, it became difficult to return to the old way of living. Warmth stopped being something that demanded attention every hour. It became reliable, predictable. And in frontier life, reliability was worth more than comfort. Children growing up in earth-sheltered homes remembered winter differently. They remembered steady light instead of flickering flames, quiet rooms instead of wind pressing against walls, sleep uninterrupted by the need to stoke embers before dawn. Illness declined. Coughs that once lingered through the coldest months faded faster. People did not attribute this to engineering or design. They simply noticed that life felt less fragile. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. Fear had shaped frontier architecture as much as necessity. Tall walls, roaring fires, and visible defenses made people feel protected, even when they were not. Earth-sheltered homes offered none of that reassurance. They did not look strong. They felt strong. That difference forced people to reevaluate what safety actually meant. Over time, resistance softened. New settlers arriving in the valley heard stories of the winter that refused to break. They heard about cabins that froze solid and a shelter in the hillside that did not. Some still built log homes out of habit, but they built differently. Cabins were placed against slopes. Foundations were deepened. Stone was added where once there had been only air. The influence of earth sheltering reached even those who never fully adopted it. Isaac Breener never became a public figure. There were no articles written about him, no formal recognition. His name survived only in conversation, attached loosely to a style of building rather than a person. A Breener-style dugout referred not to ownership, but to a way of thinking. Build for conditions, not appearances. Let physics do the heavy lifting. Decades later, when the region modernized and fuel became easier to obtain, many of the old earth shelters were abandoned. Some collapsed slowly. Others were filled in deliberately. Progress returned, as it always does, bringing new materials and new assumptions. But the knowledge did not disappear entirely. It waited. In the 20th and 21st centuries, engineers rediscovered the same principles under different names. Geothermal stability. Passive solar gain. Thermal mass optimization. Computer models confirmed what Isaac had observed by touch and experience. Underground temperatures remained stable. Dense materials stored heat efficiently. Buildings that reduced exposure required less energy to maintain. The difference was not the science. It was the context. Modern society had grown accustomed to unlimited fuel and instant solutions. When energy was cheap, efficiency felt optional. Only when systems failed, during blackouts, fuel shortages, or extreme weather, did the old lessons regain relevance. What Isaac Breener demonstrated was not a trick for extreme cold. It was a reminder about dependence. Homes that rely entirely on active systems fail when those systems fail. Homes that cooperate with their environment endure longer, with fewer demands. The ground does not need maintenance. It does not require fuel. It does not break down during emergencies. The winter of 1887 did not reward innovation for its own sake. It rewarded humility. It favored those willing to accept that nature was not something to overpower, but something to understand. Isaac did not outwork the cold. He outthought it. When people ask why earth-sheltered homes feel different, the answer is not technical. It is emotional. They feel calmer because they are calmer. They exist within a system designed for stability rather than resistance. The walls do not shout defiance at the weather. They quietly absorb it. That is why the story endures. Not because one man survived a brutal winter, but because he demonstrated a truth that applies far beyond Montana or the 19th century. Survival does not belong to the loudest solution or the most impressive structure. It belongs to the one that works when conditions are at their worst. When the cold would not end, one man trusted the ground instead of fire. And in doing so, he revealed something timeless. The most powerful solutions often look unremarkable, hide in plain sight, and ask only that we stop fighting what has always been willing to help.